Here in southeast Alaska, the Tlingit built some of the most distinctive armor on the Pacific coast. Their warriors wore carved hardwood helmets and slatted chest plates, tied together with rawhide and painted in bold clan designs. Training began young, with heavy wooden daggers and drills that built strength and discipline. War masks with shell teeth were
From quiet portraits to vibrant councils, Native women have long guided their people. Their hands-shaped baskets, clay, and stories stitched in beads. They raised families, carried future generations, and, when needed, stood as defenders of the land.
Once upon a time, the land was considered sacred, and Native peoples of North America viewed themselves as children of the Wakan Tankan, the great spirit that created all living things. The Sioux, among the main tribes that inhabited the Great Plains region, stood out for their social structure and bravery in combat. The Sioux ancestors reached the forest of north-central Minnesota and northwestern Wisconsin from the Mississippi River shortly before 800 AD. By 1300 AD, they had embraced the hallmarks of a tribal society and became known as the Seven Council Fires. The Sioux made up a confederation of several tribes that spoke three different dialects: the Lakota dialect, the Dakota dialect, and the Nakota dialect. The Lakota consisted of 7 tribal groups and were the largest of the 3 groups, occupying land in South and North Dakota. The Dakota lived mainly in Minnesota and Nebraska, while the smallest of the 3 groups, the Nakota, resided mostly in South Dakota, North Dakota, and Montana. The Sioux were a prideful people with a rich heritage. They were rulers of North American plains and grasslands, feared by other tribes from the Great Lakes region to the Rocky Mountains. They settled in western Minnesota, establishing a nomadic lifestyle on the plains. They used horses extensively, animals originally brought to the Americans by the Spanish in the 16th century. Their main source of food was buffalo meat. To assist in the buffalo hunt, the Sioux lived in tents that allowed them to move quickly and keep up with the annual migration of buffalo herds. While the Sioux were known as great warriors, the family was seen as the center of Sioux life. Children were called Wakanshin, which meant sacred being, and they were the center of their care. While monogamy was most practiced, Sioux men could marry more than one wife if he proved able to support them. The male and female roles were clearly defined, with men responsible for supporting and defending the family. Hunting was very seriously regarded, and infractions of hunting rules could lead to the offender suffering the razing of his tent or other property. The Sioux were deeply attached to spiritual practices. They believed that nature's sacred spirits brought visions and prophecies to help guide human actions. Religious dancing was common among the Sioux, and self-sacrifice rituals, inflicting wounds on themselves, affirmed their identity as warriors. This was also carried out as a sign of mourning for the death of a close relative or tribal chief. One common belief among Sioux communities is that the spirit of the deceased would travel to an afterlife. In traditional beliefs, this spiritual journey was widely believed to begin as soon as funeral procedures were complete, which took 4 days. The grieving family and friends would attend that 4-day wake to follow the spirit to its final resting place. War was another core Sioux principle. Men built their prestige through war, and warfare was reflected in their family's honor. The warriors were called Akachitas, and they mainly fought on horseback, having their main weapons bows and arrows, spears and hatchets. The Sioux Dakota entered an alliance with the French merchants at the end of the 17th century. The French were attempting to gain an advantage in the struggle for the North American fur trade against the English. The first reported encounter between the Sioux and the French occurred when explorers and traders Radisson and Des Groseilliers reached what is now Wisconsin during the winter of 1660. There was another indigenous group that traded with Europeans, the Ojibwe, who inhabited southern Canada's Great Lakes region. The Ojibwe were remarkable for their large population and expansionist tendencies, which led to conflict with neighboring tribes. The Sioux started to resent the Ojibwe trade with the French and other rival tribes, such as the Cree and Assiniboine. Tensions escalated in the 1720s and led to a drawn-out war in 1736. The Dakota Sioux lost their traditional lands around Leech Lake and Mille Lacs when they were forced south along the Mississippi River as a result of the battles. These conflicts within the tribes were also dangerous for European traders, regardless of which side they traded with. They were seen as enemies by the other. Still, trade with the French continued until the latter gave up on North America in 1763. The Europeans repeatedly attempted to create a truce between the warring tribes to protect their interests, but with limited success. As the United States developed into a nation, the American colonization of new lands became more frequent. The Sioux had many of their lands raided, and several peace treaties and negotiations were made and breached. Railways hired poachers in the 19th century to exterminate the buffalo herds to force the tribes onto reservations. As the buffalo almost quickly became extinct, both the Dakota and Lakota were forced to accept reservations set by the Americans in return for the rest of their land. Domestic cattle and corn were given to the Sioux in exchange for buffalo, making the Sioux dependent on the government for access to their basic food. The United States aimed for the treaties to encourage the Sioux to convert their nomadic hunting lifestyle to sedentary farming, as done by Europeans and Americans. By 1858, the Dakota Sioux had only a small patch of land along the Minnesota River, with no access to their traditional hunting grounds. They had to rely on treaty payoffs for their survival, often delayed. The enforced lifestyle change and vastly underpayments from the federal government wreaked financial hardship and increased social strains within the tribes. By 1862, many Sioux were famished and tensions peaked in the 1862 Dakota War. The first major showdown occurred in 1854 near Fort Laramie in Wyoming, where 19 American soldiers were killed. In retaliation, American troops killed about 100 Sioux at their camp in Nebraska in 1855 and arrested their chief. In 1866, the Red Clouds War was fought and ultimately ended in a treaty that granted the region known as the Black Hills in perpetuity to the Sioux. But the treaty was not honored by the United States in the 1870s. Gold miners swarmed into the region. Helpless and with no hope for a better fortune, the Sioux and other tribes formed the largest Indian camp ever seen by white men. Around 10,000 Indians, divided between men and women and children, tried to subsist in a place inadequate for all the families. Tired of the incessant harassment and violent retaliation, two tribal chiefs, the famous Sitting Bull and Crazy Horse, managed to get the support of Sioux warriors and their allies. This led to a series of Indian attacks on cattle ranches and small towns owned by the American colonists. The American government appointed Lieutenant Colonel George Armstrong Custer, under the command of the 7th Cavalry Regiment of the United States Army, to fight the Sioux and suppress the Indian attacks. Custer was known and hated by the Indians of several tribes already. He had a habit of attacking Indian camps when the warriors were absent and then murdered women and children. The ensuing fight became known as the Battle of Little Bighorn and went down in the history of the American West conquest. The Battle of Little Bighorn took place on June 25, 1876. The fight was a crushing victory for the Lakota Sioux and their northern Cheyenne and Arapaho allies. The 7th Cavalry, a force of 700 men, suffered a major defeat. 5 of the 12 companies on the 7th Cavalry were wiped out, and Custer was killed, as were 2 of his brothers, a nephew and a brother-in-law. Custer's body was found with 2 bullet wounds, one in his left chest and one in his left temple. Either wound would have been fatal, even though he appeared to have only bled from his chest wound. Some scholars believe that his head wound could have been caused after death. It is possible that, upon receiving a gunshot wound, Custer committed suicide to avoid capture and subsequent torture. After this battle, the Sioux split into multiple groups. The American troops' massacre of an estimated 150 to 370 Sioux men, women, and children in December 1890 heralded the end of the Sioux resistance against the American Army. Throughout the 20th and 21st century, Sioux descendants had continued to fight in courts for the right to remain in their homelands. They had asked for compensation for the abuses and crimes committed by American troops in the past. As of 2018, compensation totaled over $1 billion. However, the Sioux declined payment, demanding the return of their land. Today, the Sioux uphold many separate tribal governments, scattered across several reservations in North Dakota, South Dakota, Nebraska, Minnesota, and Montana. The Sioux are living a modernized lifestyle that bears scant resemblance to their ancient nomadic ways, but the fact they are part of one of the most powerful and courageous of the North American native nations still remains a source of pride and dignity for their descendants. Centuries before the arrival of Europeans in the Americas, North America was inhabited by countless indigenous tribes, most of who led a semi-nomadic lifestyle, roaming from one region to another in quest of new hunting grounds and gathering fruits and roots. Over time, however, population growth led to conflicts between the tribes for the best hunting grounds, which often ended in violent battles. Nevertheless, even at such a distant time, democracy had already taken root in North America. Known as the Iroquois Confederacy, this League of Nations emerged among the 5 tribes of the northeastern forest that had been tormented by retaliatory wars and violence for many generations. The Iroquois originally lived near Lake Ontario and along the Mohawk River in New York State. Around 1600, 5 tribes, the Mohawk, the Oneida, the Onondaga, the Cayuga, and the Seneca, came together to form a confederation. A 6th tribe, the Tuscarora, joined in 1722. There were other tribes that spoke in a similar language, but were not part of the Confederation. In 1650, the Iroquois started making their way to the state of Ohio, between the Great Lakes and the Ohio River. They conquered and chased out several groups of Native Americans living in the area. Resulting conflicts were known as the Beaver Wars, as the Iroquois wanted more land to hunt and capture beavers and deer. While the tribes began to work together, they surely did not renounce war. They fought and captured other native tribes, as well as waves of European immigrants arriving on the new continent. They fought against the early French and British settlers. The Iroquois took part in the fur trade with the Dutch and then the British. Unlike many other tribes east of the Mississippi River, the Iroquois generally disliked the French and usually traded their hunting spoils with the English. A small group converted to Catholicism and helped the French, but the majority of the Iroquois helped the English during the so-called French and Indian War. As was fairly typical of northeastern Indians before colonization, the Iroquois dwelled in large communal houses known as malocos, made of saplings and covered with elm bark, each sheltering many families. The Maloka family was the basic unit of traditional Iroquois society and provided a form of social organization. Agriculture was the main food source, and the women had a specific role, as they were thought to be connected to the land's power to generate life. For this reason, women were responsible for determining how food would be distributed within the community. Iroquois society was matrilineal. When a marriage took place, the groom and his family relocated to the bride's home, and the family line was traced back to her. War was important in Iroquois society. For men, self-respect depended on achieving personal glory in war. Prisoners of war were often enslaved or otherwise adopted to replace dead family members. Battle losses and disease heightened the need for prisoners, who became a significant population in Iroquois settlements by the late 17th century. During the American Revolution, the Iroquois sought to stay neutral first. Pushed to join one side or the other, some tribes such as the Tuscarora and the Oneida sided with the colonists, while the Mohawk and Seneca remained loyal to Britain, with whom they had stronger relations. In 1779, George Washington commandeered the Sullivan Expedition, led by Colonel Daniel Brodhead and General John Sullivan, against the Iroquois nations to not only invade but to destroy the British Indian Alliance. They torched many Iroquois villages throughout western New York, and the surviving Indians moved to Canada. The American Revolution wreaked great division among the colonists that also caused a rupture in the Iroquois Confederacy. The diseases brought by the Europeans dwindled the Iroquois population to a fraction of what it had been in the past. Hundreds of years of coexistence between the tribes and the collective government were superseded.
These photographs honor the strength of Native women. In councils, they help guide the path forward. Their hands shaped baskets and pottery, weaving stories into every bead. They cared for families, built communities. Mothers carried new life with quiet grace. And when
in the early 1800s, the Tlingit of Southeast Alaska fought the Russian Empire with a mix of old traditions and new technology. Their armor and weapons were unlike anything else on the continent. Inside the longhouses, warriors suited up in layered spruce slat armor and tiered helmets painted with clan crests. Flexible yet strong, the pieces were lashed together with sinew.